Hello and welcome, I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. 2 Israeli embassy staff are killed in a shooting near the Capitol Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C., sparking outrage and an FBI investigation. Israel calls it a depraved act of anti-Semitic terrorism as US officials vow strong action against those responsible. US President Donald Trump repeats false claims of white genocide in South Africa, sparking a tense exchange with President Ramaphosa. He denies persecution of whites as Ramaphosa tries to repair US ties after aid cuts and a diplomatic freeze. Israel says 100 aid trucks entered Gaza, but the UN reports nothing has reached those in need as flour shortages persist. Netanyahu floats a possible ceasefire for a hostage deal, but vows to continue the military push for full control of Gaza. Over a dozen governments condemn Israel after troops fire near diplomatic delegations in the West Bank. Israeli army claims warning shots were fired when envoys veered off a pre-approved route near Jenin. Iran confirms a 5th round of nuclear talks with the US will be held in Rome this Friday. Tehran agrees to Oman's mediation proposal amid efforts to ease tensions and revive diplomacy. Israel says it shot down a missile launched from Yemen, triggering sirens across central Israel. The attack bears Houthi trademarks, though the group hasn't claimed it, despite vowing to keep striking in solidarity with Gaza. Kim Jong-un slams a botched destroyer launch as a criminal act that disgraced the nation's dignity. The 5,000-ton warship was likely side-launched, a first for Pyongyang, but the serious accident sparked harsh rebuke from Kim. Dozens are injured as riot police clash with retirees and activists demanding higher pensions outside Argentina's Congress. The chaos erupted after lawmakers failed to reach quorum on key bills, sparking outrage in Buenos Aires. Our top story today: Israel says 100 UN and international aid trucks entered Gaza via the Karim Shalom crossing point, according to SOGAT, the Defense Ministry unit overseeing Palestinian civil affairs. All aid was inspected before entry. The UN confirmed this statement and said that it had dispatched around 90 trucks carrying aid into Gaza. In Gaza, the Hamas government media office reported the arrival of 87 aid trucks, which it said were allocated to international and local organizations to meet urgent humanitarian needs. This comes as Netanyahu said it was necessary to avoid a humanitarian crisis in order to preserve Israel's freedom of operational action in Gaza. He also stated that all of the Gaza Strip will be under the Israeli army's control by the end of its ongoing intensified offensive in the Palestinian territory. Moreover, the Israeli Prime Minister said that he was ready for a temporary ceasefire to secure the return of hostages held in Gaza, adding 20 of them were certainly alive and up to 38 were deceased. Here's what he said.
כוחותינו תופסים עוד ועוד שטחים כדי לנקות אותה ממחבלים ומתשתיות הטרור של החמאס. ובסוף המהלך הזה, כל שטחי רצועת עזה יהיו בשליטה ביטחונית של ישראל, והחמאס יוכרע כליל. נותרו בוודאות עוד 20 חטופים חיים ועד 38 חטופים חללים. אנחנו נשיב את כולם. אם תהיה הזדמנות להפסקת אש זמנית, להחזרת חטופים נוספים, ואני רוצה להדגיש, הפסקת אש זמנית, אנחנו ערוכים לזה. כדי לשמר את חופש הפעולה המבצעי שלנו, וכדי לאפשר לידידים הטובים ביותר שלנו להמשיך לתמוך בנו, אנחנו צריכים למנוע משבר הומניטרי.
Meanwhile, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has voiced guarded optimism for a solution to end the Gaza war. Here's what he said.
There were times in the past, so I don't want to get over my ahead of myself or over my skis, but I have some level of optimism that we may have breakthrough achievements here pretty quickly, hopefully, on an end to this and the release of all the hostages. Again, I have felt that way now at least 4 separate times in the last couple of months, and for one reason or another, at the last minute, it didn't happen. And so I don't want to be disappointed on it again, but I want you to know there are efforts ongoing to both provide more humanitarian assistance and bring about the end of this to this conflict as it's ongoing, because frankly, you can't begin to provide the lives that the people who live there deserve, free of Hamas, until...
According to reports coming out of the Palestinian territory, at least 93 people have been killed in Israeli attacks across the Gaza Strip since dawn on May the 21st. More than a dozen have been killed in Israeli attacks across Gaza since midnight, including a strike on a warehouse housing displaced Palestinians in the Deir el-Balah that has killed at least 9 people. On the other hand, the Israeli military has reported that it intercepted a missile fired from the Gaza Strip. Sirens had sounded in South Israel's Lachish area before it was identified. No reports of injuries or damage have been reported so far. Now, in a related development, more than a dozen countries have condemned Israel after its forces fired near a convoy of foreign diplomats visiting the Jenin refugee camp in the occupied West Bank. The diplomats, who included officials from the EU, UK, China, Russia and several other nations, were part of a coordinated visit to assess the humanitarian situation. Israel said troops fired warning shots after the group deviated from a pre-agreed route, though diplomats dispute this, saying no clear warning was issued. While no one was hurt, global reaction has been swift. European powers, including France, Germany and the United Kingdom, have summoned Israeli ambassadors and demanded explanations. Canada called the incident totally unacceptable, and countries like Ireland, Turkey and Egypt accuse Israel of violating diplomatic norms and international law. Let's listen in to what the Canadian Prime Minister had to say, and the EU Foreign Policy Chief.
We expect a full investigation. We expect a immediate explanation of what happened. It's totally unacceptable. We are conscious that we have an ability, if we so choose, to complete the Golden Dome with investments and partnership. And it's something that we are looking at and something that has been discussed at.
We definitely call on Israel to investigate this incident and also hold these accountable who are responsible for this, and any threats on diplomats' lives are unacceptable. As Israel is also a signatory to Vienna Convention, has the right, the obligation to guarantee the security of all.
Many cited the Vienna Convention, which guarantees the safety of diplomatic personnel. Norway, Portugal and Mexico emphasised that firing near clearly marked diplomatic convoys is a grave breach of that treaty. The Palestinian Authority called the act a heinous crime and said the diplomats were there to witness the aftermath of Israeli military operations in Jenin. Since January, Israeli forces have been conducting a major crackdown in the West Bank, which the UN says has displaced tens of thousands and left over 100 Palestinians dead. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that Israel's military has crushed refugee camps in the occupied West Bank. Here's what he said in his press briefing.
נדמה לי במחצית השנה האחרונה, אנחנו עשינו משהו שלא נעשה אף פעם. אנחנו נכנסנו גם לא ב-2003. אנחנו נכנסנו ב-2002. אנחנו נכנסנו בחומת מגן, כן? אנחנו נכנסנו סימולטנית למחנות הפליטים המובילים, פשוט ריסקנו אותם. והדבר הזה הביא לירידה סטטיסטית מאוד משמעותית בפיגועים, אבל זה לא משנה.
On the other hand, the Israeli military expressed regret for the inconvenience, but the fallout continues to escalate. Leaders from around the world are now calling for a thorough investigation and accountability, warning that any harm to diplomats undermines international order. We're now joined by our guest today, Dr. Punsara Amara Singh, who's at the Koltawala Defence University, located in Colombo. Thank you very much, Dr. Amara Singh, for joining us on the programme. I want to first start in the Gaza Strip, where Benjamin Netanyahu has says that he will let these aid trucks through in order to prevent a humanitarian crisis. These trucks are facing logistical problems getting through. We've had reports of some of them getting through today. However, he says that he only wants to let these trucks in to preserve Israel's allies. Can I get your analysis of this situation? It's been going on for a couple of days now, this rising criticism of Israel from its top Western alliances.
Yeah, actually that can be taken as a sense of optimism as Netanyahu stepped down from his vehement position towards Gaza. Because yesterday, for the first time since last December, Netanyahu held a press briefing allowing the journalists to ask questions, where he clearly stated that he reiterated the idea of total elimination of Hamas at the end of the Israeli military offensive, but emphasized the fact that Israel is willing to go for not a permanent but a temporary ceasefire. Temporary ceasefire allowing the humanitarian aid to be conducted for the preservation of the faith of the Israeli allies. I mean, that could be accepted. At the same time, we have to view that from the point of view of the greatest, enormous pressure bestowed upon Israelis for the past few days. You can clearly see the international community has been quite critical towards Israelis' policy towards Gaza. Mainly Canada, United Kingdom, and France have made joint statements. And in the morning, the Uruguay summoned Israeli ambassador. So Uruguay happened to be the second country to summon Israeli ambassador after the UK did. So there is a kind of a huge, enormous pressure going on against Israel. And even within Israel, you can see the left-wing, the political parties are rallying around Tel Aviv, not demonstrating and advocating their voices against the military machinery of Netanyahu, saying that if this continues to grow, Israel is likely to be a pariah state, as what exactly happened to South Africa a few decades ago. So the voice coming from the Prime Minister seems to be quite an optimistic move towards not a permanent, but a temporary ceasefire.
Yes, and Dr. Amara Singh, this has obviously spiraled in the last couple of days, but this blockade, which is causing a lot of controversy, has been going on for 11 weeks. This is the thing that has had diplomats and leaders raise their voices of concern about this situation. And we obviously have to also talk about the situation where diplomats from countries including UK, EU and China and Russia were fired upon in the West Bank, warning shots. Is Israel facing a diplomatic tipping point, do you think?
Yes. From a vantage point of view, you have to understand Israel is a party to Vienna Convention of the diplomatic treaty, the diplomatic immunity and the diplomatic privileges. So the Article 16 of this particular treaty clearly states that the host country has an obligation to take care of the well-being of the diplomats. So if Israel continues, if Israel involves in these kind of actors deliberately or maybe unwillingly, that can be taken as a blatant violation of public international law. So in that context, there is a huge the pressure at the same time moral dilemma upon Israel to adhere to at least several norms of international law by providing the adequate protection for the diplomatic community, diplomats who are visiting Israel, who are trying to help the Gazan in this moral crisis.
Yes, Dr. Amara Singh, just one final question. Prime Minister Netanyahu has not been silent about the fact that he wants Israel to take over the entire Gaza Strip, or at least have it under Israeli military control. What are the potential ramifications of this in regards to the regional stability of the Middle East? We obviously see the Houthis firing upon Israel in solidarity with the Palestinians. What are the ramifications of doing this, a Palestinian territory?
That's a pretty good question. So if you look at the history of the brief history of the conflict, the Netanyahu had never been a critique of Hamas. When Netanyahu was in power in 2005, even before that, he consistently supported Hamas because he simply wanted to have a proxy war by dividing the Palestinian aspiration, the aspiration for a separate state. So while supporting Hamas, he wanted to isolate Mohammed Abbas's Palestinian Authority by coming to the mainstream, which he accomplished, but it finally boomerang upon Israel in 2023. Now Netanyahu has a vision to eliminate Hamas. So from a theoretical point of view, you can quite see that the IDF has partially achieved what it wanted to achieve from this military offensive. All the top-class Hamas leaders are being eliminated. Yahya Sinwar is gone. And you can see Ismail Hania is gone. Mohammed Deif, the mastermind, the architect behind the 7th of October massacre, is dead and gone. And even the current leader is presumed to be dead. But what is next? The next thing that Netanyahu is well aware of the fact that even after eliminating all these leaders, if the land remains to be left alone, definitely Hamas will pop up again. The Hamas will back to normal. So from a military point of view, IDF simply wants to finish the task what it started several months ago. So if IDF completely assimilates the Gaza Strip to the mainland, to Israel territory, so then that is likely to be a long-lasting regional stability for the security architecture in the Middle East.
Dr. Pansara Amari Singh, thank you very much for your insight and joining us on the programme. We now move over to the United States, where in a tense White House meeting, US President Donald Trump confronted South African President Cyril Ramaphosa with discredited claims of a so-called white genocide. Trump played a video alleging White House farmers are being killed and forced to flee South Africa. Let's listen in to the US President.
A lot of people are very concerned with regard to South Africa, and that's really the purpose of the meeting, and we'll see how that turns out. But we have many people that feel they're being persecuted, and they're coming to the United States. So we take from many locations if we feel there's persecution or genocide going on. And we had a lot of people. I must tell you, Mr. President, we have had a tremendous number of people, especially since they've seen this. Generally, they're white farmers, and they're fleeing South Africa, and it's a very sad thing to see. But I hope we can have an explanation of that, because I know you don't want that.
Ramaphosa firmly denied these accusations, stating South Africa does not support land sieges from white farmers and the government condemns violence of any kind. Trump, undeterred, said he wanted an explanation of the farmer situation, but Ramaphosa stood firm, pointing to democracy and diverse voices in South Africa, while urging Trump to listen to facts and not fiction. Here's what the South African president had to say.
Take President Trump listening to the voices of South Africans, some of whom are his good friends, like those who are here. When we have talks between us around a quiet table, it will take President Trump to listen to them. I'm not going to be repeating what I've been saying. I would say if there was Afrikaner farmer genocide, I can bet you these three gentlemen would not be here, including my Minister of Agriculture. He would not be with me.
Despite the ambush, Ramaphosa called the meeting very well and used the opportunity to push for a reset in US-South Africa relations. He stressed the importance of trade, investment and job creation to tackle poverty and crime. Ramaphosa also invited Trump to visit South Africa to continue discussing tariffs and critical minerals. We're now joined by Andrew Latham, Professor of International Relations at Macalester College and Senior Fellow located in St. Paul, Minnesota. Thank you very much, Andrew, for joining us on the program today. A seemingly second coordinated ambush by the US president. What are your initial thoughts when you saw this? A TV was rolled in. He asked for the lights to be dimmed. Are future leaders going to be concerned about something like this happening to them now? It's the second time this has happened.
Yes, well, it wasn't quite as bad as the Zelensky episode a month or so back, but it was President Trump both reflecting and playing to an element of his base, which is convinced that there's a white genocide taking place in South Africa. And so it looked like it might have gone pear-shaped pretty quickly, but it didn't, because both the South African president and the American president recognize that in a multipolar world in which the US is competing with China in all kinds of ways, the South Africans would like to be not entirely in the United States orbit, but they would like investment, and they would like some kind of counterbalance to Chinese influence in Africa. And of course, the United States would really like to balance China in Africa, but also access to critical minerals and rare earth elements. And so at the end of the day, interests prevailed rather than delusions. And it looks like a reset in the relationship between these two countries. And maybe for the first time, President Trump has a very, how should I put this? He's used some vulgarities in the past talking about African nations. And so this is a bit of a reset for him too, I think, recognizing that South Africa is really actually quite important in terms of American national interests, both economic and geopolitical.
Yes, and Andrew, these claims of a white genocide have been are widely disputed. Some even call them conspiracy theories. Trump has brought them to the highest office in America. Some would say the most powerful office in the world. What do you think of this? How do you analyze that? He is certainly putting these theories on a platform. What are your views?
Well, the reality on the ground in South Africa, of course, is that in post-apartheid South Africa, there's been land reform, and there have been winners and losers, but there's been no violence or arbitrary actions. There's a legal regime that has been put in place by the post-apartheid South African government to reform land ownership. I'm sure there have been some quote-unquote losers in that process, and I'm sure some of them have fled to the United States and the United Kingdom and Canada and elsewhere. But there is no white genocide. That's madness. And yet the part of the MAGA base in the US continues to believe that there's a white genocide going on. Of course, it's consistent with a lot of their other crazy ideas. I don't know how else to put it. And so, as I said earlier, Trump both reflects that view and is playing to that part of his base. But at the end of the day, and here's the promising, optimistic part of this story, at the end of the day, basically, shook hands with Ramaphosa and said, let's do business. Let's do business, literally, in terms of economics, and metaphorically in terms of geopolitics. And so I think President Trump was gesturing towards his base, but at the end of the day recognized that there were other issues that, I was going to say trumped, superseded those domestic political imperatives.
Andrew Latham, thank you very, very much for joining us on the programme. We now move on. Oman says the fifth round of Iran-US nuclear talks will take place in Rome on Friday. Iran has confirmed it will participate in the meeting. The announcement came from the Omani Foreign Minister Badr al-Bursandi. The Gulf nation is acting as a mediator in the talks between Tehran and Washington. Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Ismail Baghei said that Tehran has agreed to a proposal put forward by Oman to host the talks in the Italian capital. He reaffirmed that the Iranian negotiating team is committed to defending the nation's rights, which includes the peaceful use of nuclear energy and the lifting of what he called unjust sanctions. The most recent round of talks took place in Muscat on May the 11th. Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei said earlier this week that he does not expect the negotiations to result in any meaningful outcome. He also rejected American demands to dismantle Iran's uranium enrichment program. Uranium enrichment remains a main sticking point in the ongoing negotiations. Iranian negotiator Abbas Araghchi has earlier said that enrichment would continue with or without a deal, while American officials have stressed that any agreement must include a complete halt to enrichment. Meanwhile, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that he would welcome a nuclear deal that will prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon. Let's listen in to what Netanyahu had to say.
איראן נשארה איום רציני מאוד על ישראל. אנחנו כמובן בתיאום מלא עם ארצות הברית, מדברים איתם כל הזמן, ואנחנו מקווים, הם יכולים להשיג הסכם שימנע מאיראן נשק גרעיני. זה אומר שהוא ימנע מאיראן את היכולת להעשיר אורניום. אם זה יושג, ודאי, אנחנו כמובן נברך על כך. אבל בכל מקרה, מדינת ישראל שומרת לעצמה את הזכות להגן על עצמה מפני משטר שמאיים להשמיד אותה.
Moving on now, finance leaders from the group of G7 met in Banff, Canada, aiming to ease tensions over US tariffs and strengthen global cooperation. The talks focused on finding common ground while avoiding the deep fractures seen in 2018 summit under Trump's first round of tariffs. This year, President Trump's tariffs are broader, raising concerns across Europe and Asia. Still, ministers say there's been progress. The US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent called it a very productive day after several key meetings. Leaders discussed Ukraine support, China's non-market practices, financial crimes and drug trafficking, issues largely outside the tariff clash. French Finance Minister Eric Lombard said the mood had improved and discussions were honest and sincere. Italy's Giancarlo Giorgetti stressed a joint communique is crucial, but disagreements remain, especially on describing Russia's war as illegal. Italy and the US both want to bar pro-Russia firms from post-war Ukraine rebuilding. China's indirect support for Russia is also under G7 scrutiny. The group debated lowering the $60 per barrel cap on Russian oil as the EU drafts more sanctions. Despite no communique yet, many said unity is growing. Japan, Germany, France and Italy face tariff hikes by July. The UK and Canada are already managing steep duties. Bessent held productive talks with Japan, Canada and Germany, signalling some easing of US positions. German official Joachim Nagel said the US better understands Europe's stance now. G7 host Francois-Philippe Champagne said we are stronger together. Let's listen in to some of these world finance ministers.
Vous êtes discuté, vous savez, la France et le Canada ont une longue tradition de coopérer dans les événements internationaux, dont le G7. Il y a un alignement, je dirais, presque parfait entre notre vision sur ce qu'on doit faire. Évidemment, moi, j'ai toujours dit on est à restaurer la stabilité dans nos échanges commerciaux entre les pays du G7, mais aussi parler de croissance. Donc,
I think it's a very productive discussion, and hopefully, at the end, we will have a statement that today could have a very important step. In reality, we start this morning with some difficulties, but we're able to overcome this difference, and we hope that the final statement would be very, very important and reaffirm the engagement of a G7 united in the different...
C'est grâce à cette touche particulière qui est la tienne, qui est celle de ton gouvernement, que peut-être on avance, mais il faut qu'il y ait une qualité de dialogue. Et c'est ça dont nous avons besoin dans le monde, c'est du dialogue. Et le Canada est exemplaire de ça, et d'un dialogue évidemment entre la France et le Canada qui est historique, aussi entre l'Europe et le Canada. Et voilà, on va continuer à avancer. Et on est optimiste sur ce qu'on peut faire ensemble. Et il y a une qualité de dialogue ce matin que je trouve très appréciable.
さらに日本として米国による一連の関税措置は極めて遺憾であり、日米貿易協定との整合性に深刻な懸念があると考えていると述べ、一連の関税措置の見直しを強く申し入れたところであります。その上で、少なくとも会談においては先ほど申し上げましたように、為替の水準については全く議論をしていないということ。
Well, that's all we have time for. We will continue to bring you more news updates from around the world.